Hello there and welcome to the 5th ever Shit Card Showdown, the budget battle for frame rate fanatics, an arena where aging and budget graphical solutions are put to their test. Today's contestants will be ultra affordable GPUs that can be found for $30 or less on the used market. The graphics cards that we will be testing in this showdown will be the GTS 450, the GTX 470, the GTX 550 Ti, the GTX 560, the GTX 570, the GTX 650 Ti, the HD 5870, the HD 6850, the HD 7770, and finally the HD 7850. The games that we will be testing will be Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p low settings, GTA 5 1080p high settings, Skyrim Special Edition 1080p high settings, Squad 1080p low settings, Overwatch 1080p high settings, Medieval Dynasty 720p low settings, Cyberpunk 2077 at 1024 by 768 at the low settings, and Planet Zoo 1080p low settings. We will be going in depth into the different cards used, games tested, and the testing methodology. So in the description of the video there will be timestamps for all of the different sections. In addition, the video is broken up into chapters, so if you want to skip to the benchmarks, you can. Or if you want to revisit a section, you can do that too. Each card will be benchmarked in each game, and we will be awarding points based off of 3 main criteria: highest average frame rate, highest achieved frame per dollar rating, and finally, overall performance. Points will be awarded 10 for first, 9 for second, 8 for third, and so on in that fashion. If a graphics card can't run the game, it won't receive any points for that benchmark. The overall performance is calculated by adding the points earned from both the average frame rate and the frame per dollar categories. And finally, the card with the most overall points at the end of the showdown will be crowned our overall winner. The cards that were selected for this showdown were a selection of cards priced for $30 or less on the used market. The stated prices that we used for each card is based off the trending sold listing on the North American version of eBay. So it's very likely you could find a better card for this price or one of the selected cards at a cheaper price, but it would all depend on where you live, how long you look, and if you can get lucky on the used market. I do know that some areas of the world have higher prices in general, but the relative price in comparison to other GPUs should still be similar, and the performance tested will be the same. But to simplify things and to allow us to get a score for these cards, we will be using the trending sold listing price for each card based off of the North American version of eBay. As for the cards we chose to test, we selected a variety of architectures, generations, and GPU SKUs from both Radeon and Nvidia. Unlike prior Shit Card Showdowns, we did not select any obviously inferior GPUs. These are all graphics cards that were at some point in time marketed as gaming GPUs. And if you're wondering why I didn't test a certain card, it's just that I can't fit all the cards out there in one showdown. So we did the best we could and got a wide selection from both major brands. The first card selected was the NVIDIA GTS 450. With the cheapest trending price of $12, it is also one of the oldest cards tested. Originally released in September of 2010, it was a mid-range card at the time. Sporting 192 CUDA cores at a 785 MHz core and a 1570 MHz shader clock, it has an identical GPU as to what you would find in the Quadro 2000. This GPU also has 1GB of GDDR5, a bus width of 128 bits, giving it a 58GB per second memory bandwidth. With such an affordable price, if this card performs, it will certainly be one of the better value contenders. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. The GTX 470 was the oldest NVIDIA card tested, originally released in March of 2010 for $350. It can now easily be picked up for right around $25. With 448 CUDA cores at a 700 MHz core clock and a 1400 MHz shader clock, this has a core over twice as powerful as the GTS 450. With 1280 MB of GDDR5, a 328-bit bus, and a 134GB per second memory bandwidth, this card ought to do just fine. The GTX 470 was the winner of the first ever Shit Card Showdown, so let's see how this card has aged. The next card we tested was the GTX 550 Ti. Originally released for $150 in March of 2011, you can now pick this GPU up for right around the $15 price point. The GTX 550 Ti is based off the same GF116 die as the GTS 450, so as such it has the same 192 CUDA cores, but at a much higher clock of 900 MHz on the core and 1800 MHz on the shaders. In addition, the GTX 550 Ti has a larger bus width of 192 bits, giving it a larger bandwidth of 98.5 GB per second. I'm very curious to see how this card does against its older rival. The GTX 560 is quite a step up stat-wise from the 550 Ti. However, price-wise, it's only $5 more for a total trending price of $20. The core on the GTX 560 has a healthy 336 CUDA cores at an 825 MHz core clock and a 1650 MHz shader clock. It has 1 GB of GDDR5, a 256-bit bus for a memory bandwidth of 128 GB per second. This card may not be the fastest card we test, but with a cheaper price than some, it will hopefully perform well in terms of value. The GTX 570 is arguably the fastest NVIDIA GPU that we tested for this showdown. With a solid $30 price point, it is also one of the most expensive. The GTX 570 that we tested has 480 CUDA cores at a 735 MHz core clock and a 1470 MHz shader clock. It also has 1280 MB of GDDR5 with a 328-bit bus, giving this card a 192 GB per second memory bandwidth. Just like the 470, we tested the 570 in a previous Shit Card Showdown. During the second Shit Card Showdown, this card tied for the first place performance winner, so I'd love to see how this GPU is aged and how it will do against its new budget rivals. The last NVIDIA card that we tested was the GTX 650 Ti. This is the newest card that we tested, with a $30 trending sold price at the time of making this video. It's the only NVIDIA GPU tested that can make use of the newest drivers, so that's a solid plus. With 768 Kepler Stream processors at 930 MHz and 1 GB of GDDR5, it also has one of the strongest cores of any GPU tested. It unfortunately only comes equipped with a 128-bit bus for a meager 86 GB per second memory bandwidth. This will surely have an impact on performance, but we'll just have to see how it handles each game. The first Radeon card that we tested was the HD 5870. Originally released in September of 2009, this was the fastest single CPU die graphics card in the world when it was released. Originally priced at around $380, you can now easily find them for $20. The HD 5870 is based off of the Terascale 2 architecture. It has 1600 stream processors with a 850 MHz core clock. It has 1 GB of GDDR5 with a bus width of 256 bits, giving it a memory bandwidth of 154 GB per second. On paper, this card is still very capable, but due to its older architecture and inability to use the newest drivers, we'll see how it stacks up against the competition. The Radeon HD 6850 was the next GPU that we tested. The trending sold listing price for this card is $15. Just like the 5870, the 6850 is based off of the Terascale 2 architecture. It has 960 stream processors at an 800 MHz clock. It sports 1 GB of GDDR5 with a decent 256-bit bus, giving it a 128 GB per second memory bandwidth. The next card that we tested was the Radeon HD 7770 with an original release price of $160. You can now easily find one of these for $15 or less. They were very popular mid-range GPUs for their time, so there still are plenty of them floating around out there. The HD 7770 is based off of the DirectX 12 capable GCN architecture, which allows it to use the most modern drivers. In addition, it has 640 stream processors at a 1 GHz core clock. It also comes equipped with 1 GB of GDDR5 and a 128-bit bus, giving it a 72 GB per second memory bandwidth. The last graphics card that we tested was the HD 7850 with a trending sold listing price of $25. This card looks to be a great value. With 1024 GCN stream processors at 875 MHz, it has arguably the best CPU core of any tested. It also comes with 2 GB of GDDR5 and a 256-bit bus, giving it a 154 GB per second memory bandwidth. Like the GTX 470 and 570, the HD 7850 was also showcased in a past Shit Card Showdown. The third Shit Card Showdown, the HD 7850, managed to pull a win for value as the overall winner. However, with newer games and new GPUs to judge this card against, we'll see if it can keep its Shit Card Showdown winner title. The games that were chosen for the benchmarks are a selection of popular, newer, and older titles that range from competitive multiplayer to relaxed sandbox management games. The goal in selecting games was to cover a large breadth of games that any budget PC gamer may want to play. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was the first game that we tested. We chose it as it represents modern AAA single-player narrative titles that have the ability to use both DirectX 12 and DirectX 11. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a graphically impressive and demanding game, and as such, we tested it at the lowest settings at 1080p. We chose this setting to allow us to take advantage of 1080p while still getting acceptable frame rates with these cut rate cards. GTA 5 was tested at 1080p high settings. This game was benchmarked upon request of the Socket Sanctuary community. Despite having been released over 5 years ago on the PC, it's still an incredibly popular game online with a huge community behind it. However, being over 5 years old, we did choose settings that are a bit more demanding. However, despite being tested at high settings, it should still be very smooth on most of the cards tested. Skyrim Special Edition was tested at 1080p high settings. This game was chosen to represent older open-world DirectX 11 titles. In addition, Skyrim Special Edition is the staple of many low-end gamers' libraries as it is one of the most fun and easily moddable games out there. Squad was tested at 1080p low settings. We chose this game as a stand-in for a typical new competitive multiplayer PC-only tactical shooter. We chose 1080p to allow for some of the graphical fidelity needed to see things in the far distance, yet chose low settings to allow for a smooth frame rate while doing so. Overwatch was benchmarked at 1080p high settings with a 100% render scale. Overwatch was chosen to represent competitive esports that don't always use the newest APIs. Similar to Fortnite, Valorant, and others in graphical demands, we were able to push the settings to high while still allowing good competitive frame rates on most of the cards tested. Medieval Dynasty was benchmarked at 720p low settings. This game was chosen to represent indie games that one may want to play on their low-end GPU. Based off of the Unreal 4 engine, this game is intensely demanding, which is why we only tested it at 720p low settings, as anything more than that would be difficult for these cards. Cyberpunk 2077 was tested at low settings at 1024 by 768. Cyberpunk is downright oppressive to run on newer hardware, so we tempered our expectations and dropped the resolution and settings to see if any of these cards could get a playable frame rate. Planet Zoo was benchmarked at 1080p low settings. We chose this game to represent the sandbox builder management style games. We chose 1080p low settings as it's the most we can reasonably expect to perform well with the majority of the cards tested. The test bench that we used for this showdown is our standard Intel i5-9400 benchmarking system. This test rig has a 6-core, 6-threaded Coffee Lake CPU at a 4.1 GHz max. It also has 16 GB of DDR4 with all of the games loaded onto an M.2 SSD. The power supply is a 1000 watt EVGA 80 Plus Gold Supernova. The benchmarking system should be more than enough to prevent any bottlenecks from our budget graphics cards, and let's be honest, not many people running a $30 GPU will have a Ryzen 5950X, so the performance on most systems will be very similar to what was achieved on this test bench. I think that's enough talk for now, so let's finally get started with the showdown. only about half of the cards tested had a playable frame rate at the settings tested. The HD 7850 performed well in this title both in performance and value, giving it the points needed to take the overall win in this game. The HD 7770 managed to pull out a win for value as it had a podium finish for performance, but a much cheaper price, giving it a solid 2.47 frames per dollar. Although the GTX 570 performed well at second place in terms of performance, the NVIDIA Fermi cards all had severe video artifacting on the characters' textures and clothing. In addition, despite Fermi cards technically having support for DirectX 12, the game only launched in DirectX 11 mode. That is not as bad as the Terascale cards though, as at random when recording their benchmarking run, the screen would go black and not recover until the main menu screen. Both of these issues are likely due to the fact that NVIDIA and AMD no longer support these cards with the latest drivers. The only NVIDIA card not to artifact was the GTX 650 Ti. However, due to its middling performance and higher price, it placed in the bottom half for the combined total for this game. In GTA 5, all of the cards tested had a playable performance at these settings, with the exception of the GTS 450. GTA 5 is a title that favors NVIDIA, and it shows. The GTX 570 rocketed into the performance lead with a 95 FPS average and a solid 8 FPS over the next card tested. The HD 7850 performed well in this title in both average FPS and in value, with a second place finish to each. This allowed the HD 7850 to tie the better performing GTX 570 for the combined total winner for this game. The HD 7770 managed to pull an upset win in terms of value. The HD 7770 got a respectable 3.67 frames per dollar due to its low cost. However, because it didn't perform as well as some of the others, the overall ranking fell. The GTX 560 performed well with a solid performance, however its price prevented it from ranking higher in this game. The GTX 470, although theoretically almost as fast as the 570, didn't perform as well, giving it a middling performance across the board. And finally, the Terascale cards didn't perform the greatest, and their lack of modern driver support definitely shows. Skyrim Special Edition had quite a different performance from the others so far. The GTX 570 was again the performance winner, however, with the higher price, the frame per dollar rating fell to a middling performance. The HD 5870 performed surprisingly well in this game, likely due to the older drivers having support for the older game. As a result, the Tearscale cards performed well in the value proposition, with the HD 6850 managing a tie for first place with the HD 7770 with a FPD rating of 1.87. The overall winner for this game was again the HD 7850. Although it didn't win either the performance or the value segment, it placed highly in both, allowing it 17 total points. Surprisingly, the 650 Ti didn't perform better in this game, and due to its high average cost, it performed very poorly in the value segment. However, not as badly as the GTS 450. At these settings, this card is clearly outmatched in every category. Squad at 1080p low settings was playable by most of the cards tested, again with the exception of the lowly GTS 450. The GTX 650 Ti managed an upset win in terms of average performance, with it just beating out the HD 7850 by 1 FPS. The GTX 570 wasn't far behind, with the GTX 470 pulling up the next group of cards. In terms of value, the HD 6850 managed a surprising win. With an FPD rating of 3.40, it was just slightly ahead of both the HD 7770 and HD 7850. The overall winner for this game was again the HD 7850 with 17 total points scored. The GTX 650 Ti pulled a close second with 15 points and would have likely scored higher if not for its higher price. And in typical fashion, the GTX 550 Ti and GTS 450 are pulling up the rear. In Overwatch 1080p high settings, we had another solid overall win for the HD 7850. With a 76 FPS average and a 3.04 FPD rating, it easily took first place overall. Just like we saw with Skyrim, this older game seems to have adequate support for the older cards, allowing the venerable HD 5870 to get third place in terms of performance and value, allowing it to get 16 total points and a second place podium finish in this game. The HD 7770 and HD 6850 tied in both average frame rate and tied for value first place with a 3.47 frame per dollar rating. The GTX 550 Ti and GTS 450 were the only cards tested to have a poor performance in this title and received 9th and 10th place, respectively. The GTX 470 and 560 are right in the middle per usual, but their performance is certainly acceptable in this game at these settings. Medieval Dynasty was a difficult game to run. Well, with the exception of the GTX 570, which took an across-the-board sweeping win. Not only did it win, but it won by a lot. With 64 FPS on average, it performed on average 15 FPS more than the next best card. As a result, despite the GTX 570's higher stated price, it still had the highest frame per dollar rating of 2.13. The older Radeon cards performed quite poorly in this title, with the HD 6850 and HD 5870 receiving 9th and 10th place. The HD 7850 was outperformed by the GTX 650 Ti in terms of average performance, but due to the 7850's cheaper price, it managed to eke out a higher FPD and combined total score. In Cyberpunk 2077, we had very few cards that could even launch this game. Fermi cards don't have the driver support, and Terrascale cards don't have DirectX 12, so only the newest GPUs could even run this game. The HD 7850 took the overall win for this title with a surprisingly decent average of 34 FPS. The GTX 650 Ti and HD 7770 were difficult to play and would require the cast setting to be lowered if a playable average is desired. In terms of value, the HD 7770 did win with 1.6 frames per dollar, but with such a low average frame rate, it would be hard to recommend for this title. The last game tested was Planet Zoo at 1080p low settings. The GTS 450 had an upset performance with a surprisingly high average FPS considering its power. And with its low price point, it allowed the GTS 450 to get the highest frame per dollar rating of 1.92. There is no reason why this card should have outperformed the GTX 550 Ti in this game, but I tested it twice and that's the result. And despite the peculiar performance of the GTS 450, the HD 7850 managed another solid win in this title with 18 total points scored. The GTX 570 did well in terms of performance in Planet Zoo, but again, due to its higher price, it didn't perform well in terms of value. Now we have all the games tested, let's take a look at the winners for value, performance, and the overall combined winner. The ever-faithful HD 7770 is the value winner for this Shit Card Showdown, with 76 total points scored. Despite the HD 7770's middling performance, the absolute bargain basement price of $15 allowed it to reign supreme in terms of price per frame. The HD 7850 got a solid second place for value with 65 points. Although this GPU is a bit more expensive, its superb frame rate allowed the frame per dollar score to surpass most of the others. The GTX 560 received third place in terms of value with 48 points scored. The cheaper $20 price point allowed it to outperform the GTX 570 by 2 points in this category. The HD 6850 was a good value in some of the games, however, like the HD 5870, the older terascale architecture and older drivers were its Achilles heel. The GTX 470, 550 Ti, and 650 Ti all tied for 7th place. Their higher average price and lower to middling performance cemented their spot down on the list for value. The sad little GTS 450 got last place for value with only 19 points scored. Despite being the cheapest card tested, the frame per dollar rating was outperformed by every other GPU due to its abysmal performance in games. And speaking of performance in games, the performance winner for this Shit Card Showdown is the legendary HD 7850. With great performance in all titles tested, it received 75 total points, 10 more than the GTX 570, which is the next best card. The GTX 570 performed very well with a silver podium finish. This GPU, although no longer supported by new drivers, still managed to kick some serious ass in the games we tested. The GTX 570 may have actually won if it had better driver support. The GTX 650 Ti took third place with 63 points scored. The GTX 650 Ti only managed to be the fastest card in one of the games tested, but was near the top of the list in many of the Nvidia favoring titles. The GTX 470 got fourth place with 47 points scored. Although it may have won the first ever Shit Card Showdown, it looks like its time is up as it's falling in the ranks. The HD 7770 did fairly well in 5th place. Despite being one of the cheapest cards tested, it actually performed alright in almost all of the games tested. The GTX 560 wasn't far behind with 40 points scored. The HD 5870 and 6850 were trailing behind in 7th and 8th place. The GTX 550 Ti and GTS 450 are pulling up the rear. Their performance really shouldn't be a surprise as they are very closely related. And now, for the overall winner. The winner of the 5th ever Shit Card Showdown is the distinguished HD 7850. With fantastic performance in all games tested and a price less than that of its rivals, it managed to win this Shit Card Showdown with 140 points scored. Now as the winner of 2 Shit Card Showdowns, it may be time to retire this card for the benchmarking lineup, at least for this series. The HD 7770 pulled a solid 2nd place with 120 total points scored. With an average performance and a stellar value due to its incredibly cheap price, this card earned its number 2 spot on our list. The GTX 570 got a solid 3rd place with 111 points scored. Although not the cheapest, it performed well in every game tested, with the exception of Cyberpunk, and would still be an acceptable GPU, so long as you temper your expectations. The GTX 650 was another great card. At 4th place with 92 points scored, it's a great option for those in need of a DirectX 12 capable GPU that is short and compact. The GTX 560 had a mediocre performance across the board and received a deserved 5th place with 88 points scored. The GTX 470 got 6th place with an unexceptional performance and a high-ish price. The GTX 470 is no longer as good as it once was. Although it may have won the first ever Shit Card Showdown, these past 4 years have not been kind to it. The HD 5870 and 6850 received 7th and 8th place. These are aging cards with no real future and should probably be avoided, if at all possible. The GTX 550 Ti and GTS 450 pulled 9th and 10th place. Both cards were priced high for their relative performance and are not very good options if you want to game with modern games at modern resolutions. So there we go. If you're looking for a sub $30 GPU for your ultra budget PC or are just looking for something cheap to upgrade your pre-built, the HD 7850 and HD 7770 are great options. Just try to avoid the old Terascale cards as well as the lower-end Fermi cards, and you'll probably get a card worthwhile. That's about it for this episode. If you like what you saw, be sure to hit the like button, and if you think this video might be helpful to somebody else, feel free to share it. If you have any constructive criticism, I'd love to hear it. I'm always looking for ways to improve my videos. Well, that'll be it for this Shit Card Showdown. Thank you folks for watching. May your frame rates be high and your prices low. And I'll catch you folks next time.